What's up, Liron here, and thank you for joining me in another episode of my podcast, Liron's Art and Creativity Show. I'm really excited to have you today. I've got a few interesting things on my mind that I want to share with you, and I like the way this podcast is changing a bit from each and every episode because I'm still learning this, and it's just really fun to have something so dynamic. I feel like with my YouTube channel, I'm pretty much, I already know the ropes and I know what I want to achieve and how I'm going to achieve it. And here, it's just a new learning curve for me. So in this episode, I want to talk to you about what I love about watercolor painting, and I'll give you a brief history of my work with this medium. Very short history, so it's going to be rather quick. And also I want to connect it to what medium should you choose if you're thinking about starting to paint. And this is a question I ran into when I just started painting. I did a heavy research on whether I should go with oil painting or acrylics or watercolor, and then I finally settled around watercolor. So this is basically what I want to talk about today. I really enjoy the spontaneity of the podcast, and I'm really trying to allow myself a lot of freedom to talk in whichever format I want and on whatever topic I want. So anyway, let's get started here and let's talk a bit about my background with watercolor. And I did cover this briefly on the first episode of the podcast. So basically, I started my painting journey about almost 2 years ago, I'd say. I think it's already actually, about 2 years, I guess, because I really, in the beginning, just started playing around with the medium, and I wasn't that serious for about a month or two, and then I really figured out this is what I want to do. And so about 2 years, and it's so funny because whenever I try, I believe I'm starting to get it, I get kind of punched in the face and understand that there's so much to learn. And I want to talk a bit about that in a later part of the podcast. So in any case, just a fascinating medium, and I have so much passion for it that I want to devote this entire episode to just talk about what I love about it. So my original decision to start with watercolor painting, there was one main reason to go with that, and later on I found out whole new dimensions of reasons for why I enjoy the medium so much. But the original decision, I made that just based on ease and accessibility. So watercolor painting, I think, it's not like an easy medium per se. It's definitely not an easy medium to master, but it is very accessible and easy to get started with. It's not too much chemistry going on because it's just the paint and the water, and it's rather simple, especially when you compare it to oil painting, which has a lot of work with the pigments and I guess the binders and so much going on there, and a lot of preparation, and it requires a very well aired room, I guess, with lots of windows and stuff like this. And so watercolor just seemed to me like the most accessible choice. Not to talk about it's cheaper in many ways, because it just requires less of you. So my decision to start with watercolor was rather spontaneous and just like, okay, it's the simplest, most accessible medium I can find, so I'll probably just go with that. And the funny thing is that this is how I make most of my decisions nowadays. I'm really spontaneous about this, and the moment I understand something is for me, I just go for it. And I see a lot of people are crippled by these kinds of choices, and I just go for it. And I think it is important to have some speed in life in general, just so that you can, move forward. So with that being said, watercolor is not an easy medium to master, and it's just, there are so many facets to it, so many different dimensions and aspects of mastery. And some of these are pretty general for painting, I would say. So you would bump kind of into those in other mediums as well, but some are very unique for watercolor, and so I will talk about them in just a few moments. I want to start talking about the things I really, really love about this medium. So the thing that really attracted me to it and made me find out about it for the first time and really have some kind of a spark that tells me you should try this is the way they flow and mix. So being a very wet medium, unlike, again, oil paintings and acrylics, which is a comparison that's rather simple to make, and perhaps even similar to gouache, which can be diluted with water. I just love the way they flow. And no other medium really does that in that same way, that you can just put the paint in and let it flow and mix together. And there's the whole thing of where it's wet, this is where the color moves. So if you just paint with water a square, and you can kind of inject paint into it and let it mix inside. And this is something that I just really, really love about the medium. I think there is some grace to the more dry mediums, I guess, that you can just put something in there and it's a very strong stroke. But with watercolor, this is something I really, really like, that you can actually create borders using the wet areas, and the paint will conform to them. And the whole dealing with, the water to pigment ratio, it's just such a fun activity for me. And I think a lot of people actually find it very meditative and even healing. I hear a lot of people that say this is their meditation. And of course, meditation can come in so many forms, probably endless forms. And a lot of people probably that mix a lot of oil paint, that do oil painting, and they just spend so much time mixing them on the palette. This can be like healing as well, I guess. So this is one aspect that really attracted me to watercolor. Another thing I would say is that the way you work with this medium is from light to dark, and that's probably the main way, the main approach for working at it. There are some exceptions, but generally speaking, you start with the lighter areas and you move into the dark ones, especially because you cannot correct too much. It's transparent, so there's no opaque white. You could use it, but it's not a part of the very traditional way of using it. So you can't just go over the painting more and more and more and correct it. And this will connect to another thing I'll talk about in just a moment. But you can't really endlessly work on the painting and add lighter values, go from the darks to the midtones to the highlights. It just doesn't really work that way with watercolor, and this is something I really, really enjoy. Which brings me to my next point, which is the whole thing with and by the way, the whole light to dark thing, before I move on to the next one, was very intuitive for me. I feel like I just had that approach in me, and probably the main reason is because I did draw ever since I'm a kid, and with pencil as well, you move usually, generally speaking, from light to dark. With pen as well, my method of sketching does that, and so I just think it was very intuitive for me to go in that route. Now, sorry about that. Transparency. This is the next thing I want to talk about. And because we're working in layers that are from light to dark, and because the medium is just based on water, it has transparency to it, and you can really see the layers one through another. And I think this is a fascinating aspect of watercolor, because, and this is funny because it's what attracted me to the medium, but it's a skill I am not close to mastering, because I see a lot of people that are very deliberate in their use of transparency, meaning they know where they want to make stuff more transparent, they know where to go more opaque perhaps, and each color has different characteristics. Some colors, for example, the English Venetian red of Schminke, for example, is very opaque. You have colors like Pyrrole Scarlet by Daniel Smith that are very opaque. You can't see too much through them. But then you have the more transparent and strong phthalos. And so every color has its own characteristics, but the whole transparency thing is fascinating because you get the choice and you can work in many different approaches. One of the things I love the most is these kind of sketchy watercolor portraits that are done with lots of transparency, and you can really see the brush strokes, but it feels very organic and natural still. And this is fascinating because it's a skill that I'm not even close to mastering. I mean, I have this one approach I go by, and I don't use too many layers. I don't make use of transparency too much. And for the most part, it's because I don't really know how to do that efficiently. So this is something I definitely want to improve in. And so, yeah, it's just really interesting how that works. Sometimes the things that attract you to a medium can be rather simple, and you can learn them even in like a month or a few days. And sometimes the things that attract you to a medium can be super complex. But anyway, this is another thing, another talk for another episode. Now, another thing that I really like about this kind of painting is that it's quick and it's in one go, and you don't get too many corrections. Because you move from light to dark, all you can do is save your highlights and like pray that you're not gonna mess up the work, because you just darken things slowly. And if you got it right, the drawing will read well, and it will look pretty, and it will have a good sense of light and shadow. But if you mess up, you lose that light and shadow effect, and you can't do too much about it, because the moment you start playing around with paint that's already dry or already drying, then you get this. You get a result that's really unnatural, I think, and just doesn't look good. And unless you know really well the boundaries of manipulating paint, you're gonna have a rough time with this. So this is one thing that actually attracts me, because it's quick, and I don't see myself working on a painting for a month or 2 months or a year like some oil painters do, and it's understandable. This is what the medium demands. Oils kind of work after you finish working on them, and the next day they look a little different. They look a little more perhaps well mixed or harmonious, I guess. And with watercolor you don't get that. The paint kind of dries, and once it's dry you get a good indication of what it's going to look like. So this is something I'm really attracted to, and especially as someone who has not a lot of patience many times. I like the quickness of it. I really like it. So these are the main things I like. There is one more thing I would say, and that is the challenge of giving up some of the control. I think with many other media, like even acrylic paintings, you can work rather slowly and really in a deliberate manner, and with watercolor it's a bit different. And I heard Stan Miller, which is a great artist, and I don't think I already recommended him in the artist corner. I will soon. I actually have to write it down for myself. But Stan Miller says that training your it's a fun analogy he does. He says that oil painting is like training your dog, and watercolor painting is like training your cat, which I find hilarious, and it's so true. It's like you have a way to tame watercolor, but it's just a weird way, I guess. It's just it's weird. It's just weird. You have to give up some control, and this is a big challenge. Not only mentally, like knowing you have no control over some aspects, but literally, like technically speaking, it's hard. Physically, it's hard, because what do? You try to blend an edge and it just all goes crazy. You put in a first wash and two colors mixed that shouldn't have mixed. One of them was already drying, and then it just creates weird ass flowers and blooms, and it's just... it's really, really a challenge. And I like that. I like that about it, because oil for me feels like, even though I barely did any oil or acrylics, I have a very, very limited experience in those. But they just feel more like, painting in Photoshop even, because everything is just opaque and you put one layer above the other, and you can always touch upon things, and you can always do micro corrections. And with watercolor, you don't have that. You give up control, and you just go from light to dark. You do your best to save the lights. You hope for the best, and it's a challenge with the giving up the control there, and knowing that you can't know the result. And think about it even in a practical way. As a teacher or someone who does demonstrations, you have no idea how your demo is going to turn out. It may turn out not so good, and I know a lot of very seasoned artists that give demos, and the demos end up being not good because of the volatility of the medium and the lack of control, and then they just scrap it. They just go, okay, didn't turn out well, let's do another one. And I think that's a challenge you sort of get into this acknowledging. You have to acknowledge it when you get into watercolor painting. So after 2 years, I can definitely attest to the fact that the learning curve is insane with watercolor. It's like sometimes you're at the top of your game, you feel like you're really doing great, and you have a series maybe of a few paintings that are just, you nailed it, and you feel really good about them. Then the next day you go for it again and it's lame and you don't get the result you want and the colors are ugly and it's just yuck and it doesn't read well. And it can be a bit frustrating at first, the volatility. But the more you get used to it and the more you become patient with it, I guess, the more you start to get a grip on it. And the thing that's fascinating to me is the lessons I take from watercolor painting into my life. That's really the crazy part, because it does teach you patience. It does teach you to give in to the process. It does teach you to be as controlled as possible in all of the places you can, and giving up on control on everything you can't. Because really, and this is a life lesson for me as well, because I'm really interested in self-development. So when you try to control things that are outside of your control, you're basically torturing yourself. It's just not going to happen. You can't control some things in life, and if you think you can, and if you delude yourself that you can, and if you try to control them, you just end up being miserable. And this is one thing that actually, funny enough, watercolor painting really taught me and really gave me this lesson of giving up control in some areas, especially when it comes to other people and the weather and things and circumstances and things that are, if you can find that sweet spot, that balance between really being on top of the things that you can control and letting go of the things you cannot, I think it's really a good balance in life in general. And so watercolor is really humbling that way, because you think you're on top, and then you're not, and the next day, and you have to continuously go back to the student mentality, which is a concept I don't talk about too much. I did talk about it in a few older videos. The student mentality means that you're always open to, or at the moment rather, you're open to receiving new knowledge. And it's sort of a binary switch that you decide if you're going to have that approach or not. But it's easier said than done, because sometimes it is not easy to get into that mentality, and you can be wrapped up in ego and in feelings of, I already did 10 or 20 really good paintings, so I know things. And it sounds funny to say, but that's actually how it works in my mind sometimes. And I have to be able to let it go, and it's a big challenge, let me tell you. It's really a big challenge sometimes. So getting into the student mentality. One quick tip I can give you, by the way, for getting into the student mentality is that using a new medium. That's one of the best ways to experience it. If you forgot what it feels like, this is a good way to just have a quick solution, a quick fix for getting a feeling for what it's like. Because once you try out a new medium, you have no baggage. You have nothing to compare to, no past successes, no past failures. And I find that it really allows me to go back to that mindset that actually I think is responsible to a lot of success. I think that, and this is an extraordinary ability. If you can tap into that mental state of constantly learning new things, it's like a superpower. Not just in painting, but in many things in life. And I think also, of course, in mastering an artistic skill. If you can tap into that ability, I think that's insane. So anyway, now the final thing I want to touch upon is what this means for you if you're in a position in which you want to start painting. So I would say this. If you prefer having a lot of control and really being slow and measured, perhaps give a try to oil and acrylic painting, and maybe even gouache. If you like to have things really at a slow pace, and if you enjoy mixing paint that is more of a not doughy texture, but I don't know how to call this texture, but just out of the tube, if you like that squishy texture and just a lot of mixing like that on the palette and applying the paint very dryly to a canvas, if this is something that you think you like, go for that. If you're like me and you look for, and I say this as a person that is actually really curious to dive deeper into oil and acrylic paintings. It's something I do want to try in the future. But if you're more like me and you are more like the spontaneous, quick, flowy approach, definitely I would give a go to watercolor painting. It's really the most accessible medium out there, I think. It's cheap, it's easy for the setup. You just need like a towel and a small palette that usually comes together with the paint you purchase, and water reservoir, which is simple, like a jar or something. The paper is rather cheap. It's not a canvas that's a little more expensive, so I would give that a go. But me personally, I'm really curious about the other painting mediums. One more thing I would say, if you're not sure what kind of medium to use, is to look for art that you enjoy looking at, and if you find an artist that works that achieves a look that you like, maybe it's a hint to try that medium. Maybe, not always. Sometimes you can enjoy art that from the type that you wouldn't want to make. For me, for example, and this is, I think, a very interesting correlation or analogy rather. I really enjoy animation, everything that has to do with animation. I really love, animes also. I used to love them as a kid and watch them, and also mangas, like the Japanese art. This is another good example. So I love comics and manga. This whole Japanese style. I love anime, and the work of animators fascinates me, but it's not something I would want to do myself. You get it? So even if you are attracted to it, you won't necessarily want to do it, because maybe it doesn't suit your constitution. But it can be a good hint for some kind of motivation to try that out. So I would definitely go in that direction as well, just when thinking about it. So this is basically it for today's episode. There's one thing I want to do now, and on the last one I didn't have an artist corner. In this one I do want to have an artist corner, and I'll also I'll provide all the information down below, and also for Stan Miller that I mentioned earlier, and some other things that we talked about. But today's artist is Marek Yanai, and this is actually, I decided to take a bit of a different turn here. He's a watercolor artist, but he's Israeli. He's from Jerusalem, and his work is beautiful. He's one of the people that I really connect with the look they achieve in their work. He loves to keep the paint pure and vibrant and very, very authentic. So he doesn't mix too many grays usually, and the result is beautiful. And I also like his approach. He's kind of similar to Stan Miller. He works in patches. He's less of the impressionistic Alvaro Castanet, Joseph's Bookwich style. He's more of the let's work really slowly and carefully read the values and see what colors we can see in reality. He's also a big believer in working from real live reference and not from pictures, which I think is really important as well. So he's just a very interesting man. I did visit one of his workshops, and it was interesting to see. So I definitely recommend you check out his work. I will put a link to his website that you can see his gallery, and also I'll put a link to maybe one or two of his YouTube videos. This is how I originally found out about him. He has a few really, really beautiful full painting processes for portraits, and it's just amazing. You'll see this in action, and you won't believe it at times. It's like, whoa, it's like magic, really. So I really recommend you check it out. He's teaching in Bezalel Academy of Art in Jerusalem, which is a very popular art school here in Israel, and I think it's pretty renowned worldwide. And so highly recommend you check out his work. I'll also link to Stan Miller's channel. If you decide to start with watercolor painting, definitely check out his channel. He has by far the best tutorials out there, I think. So anyway, this is it. I want to thank you so much for listening. This is something I'll never take for granted. Every day I'm just so humbled by the fact that I can talk and people listen, and you can enjoy it and maybe even learn something. Thank you so much. I will put everything below, and if you want to contact me or let me know what you think about this episode, I'd be thrilled. Also, I'll have all the information in the show notes, plus links to the YouTube channel, to my Instagram, and everything else we talked about. Really, thanks again. Have an amazing day or night wherever you are. I really, really appreciate it, and I will see you again in the next episode.